Thank you. I sense a certain nervousness. That's like, because you never invited. Oh my God, what have you done? Well, let's see. All right, so my name is Paolo Pedercini. I teach art at Carnegie Mellon University, and I must confess, I'm nervous too. I mean, when I got the invite, I felt like terribly inadequate, unqualified, an imposter syndrome. I have never studied philosophy in my academic career, and I was like, what am I gonna say? But then I thought about this joke here, which is a silly joke. I think it helps to see philosophy not only as a specialized discipline, not only as a conversation between very smart and usually dead people spanning across millennia, but rather philosophy as a mode of thinking or thinking about thinking that we all engage with every now and then. So. All I can offer is obviously a perspective of a developer. For over 10 years under a project Mall Industria, I've been making games tackling a variety of social issues. Mall Industria is not only about making games with a message, about using that procedural rhetoric, but also about challenging the political neutrality of video games as a whole, about experimenting with the game language in a way that points to the dominant ideology and biases of the electronic entertainment in general. Anyway, every day when I play and when I make games, I wonder what games mean, in the larger cultural context and how they produce meaning. So what I'd like to propose today is a couple of issues that I think have not been examined closely enough, at least as far as I know. These are issues I often struggle with and while making games, and I might need some help from you people. These are like papers, idea. So you see, game makers are often a little bit too caught into the minutiae of development, and business and promotion and self-promotion, while game critics are often too engaged in day-to-day culture wars that are sort of happening at the speed of Twitter. So they are a bit too busy to ask that kind of big, deep questions. And so perhaps you folks are better position of coming from a philosophical perspective, and you have the right distance and time and mindset to unpack some of these issues. All right, so games are nothing like natural language, but we can try to map on them two of the main approaches to the types of theories of meanings. There are two concerns typically. One is a more semantic concern that would be something like, what is the meaning of a game? What is the meaning of a text, right? And in our case of games, according to a player or a group of players. And another concern is more foundational, is more, I guess, more meta, which is complementary in a way. They're not mutually exclusive, but is why does a player or a group of players attribute a certain meaning to a game? And I think there is a lot of work that has been done on unpacking the semantic concern. We were talking about where Ian Bogost was mentioned, Espen Harset, and so on. The thing is, computer games are terribly inefficient as a machine for the production of meaning. They are assemblages of heterogeneous materials with a lot of moving parts. They are exceptionally ambiguous. And the ambiguity of games, I think, and all interactive artifacts is twofold. It comes from kind of two things. There is an ambiguity that they share with every other form of other linear and representational forms, and it derives from the process of signification. What am I looking at? What is that? It's a mushroom. Is the sign a reference to psychedelic culture and so on? And no, by the way, it is not directly, at least. And then there is another type of openness that appears only when the text itself, its internal structure, can be reconfigured, which is the case of games that are computational interactive media. So what is that object doing in the economy of that game? And what signs, what is the science, why is that sign associated to that behavior? So that's another type of question, right? So ambiguity of games usually cuts across these two types of openness. Like, for example, the end of much talked, much discussed end of the game Braid by Jonathan Blow produced a multiplicity of interpretations due to the interplay and of the open-ended epilogue, right? And the mechanic that sets it in motion. So it's not just like an openly, like narratively ambiguous. And also BioShock, classic example, has been called both a critique and a love letter to objectivism because of the disconnect between the dystopian scenario, so this kind of like narrative and environmental storytelling we are capable of analyzing with traditional narratological tools, and the sort of hyper-individualistic, leveling-based first-person shooter gameplay. That's what has been referred as Ludo narrative dissonance, right? So it kind of like comes from this interaction and from this transversal twofoldness. So I think game criticism is getting used to combine these two approaches, or to understand these two aspects of games, and not only analyzing what a certain sign says, like, for example, oh, the stereotypically gendered character of Miss Pac-Man, but also what they say once they are set in motion, and once the complex process of role play starts to happen, right? So here's a concept that I'm proposing that might help us to cross the semantic minefield that are video games. The rhetorical scope that is related to the rhetorical procedural rhetorics. Games are representational media, right? They are always seen to reference some aspects of our world. Games represent things not only visually, but also procedurally. The block of Tetris might be abstract, but their behavior is reminiscent of solid objects. They fold, they stack, they respond to collision. So SimCity aspires to model many aspects of a city, right? And a first-person shooter, for as much fantasy it could be, will always approximate some aspect of ballistics that we sort of recognize. But obviously, not everything in a game maps neatly on real-life systems, right? Game representations are inherently simplified and limited, and what to include and what to exclude in a model is one of the most crucial choices in game design. That's where the biases emerge. That's when you can detect the system of value of the designer itself, like what to put in this modelization between real city and simulated city. What do you decide to include, what you left out? That is quite important. So in game development, we use the term scope to refer to the planned set of features that we intend to implement in a game. It's almost like a production and development type of term, like how much money and bodies and energy we can invest in creating a fully functional toilet in this first-person shooter and so on. But when making socially socially aware games, when making persuasive games, we can also talk about a rhetorical scope, that is defining the subject of our inquiry. So the recently released Prison Architect, for example, lets you design and manage a prison in a classic management gameplay, you know, like management scene gameplay, tycoon gameplay. So you put down rooms, you hire staff, and so on. It refers to the North American prison system pretty directly, or at least its view as mediated by films and popular culture. You can micromanage really maniacal infrastructural details, but the causes of a dysfunctional prison system are mostly left out of the game. They are mostly out of its rhetorical scope, arguably. So it does provide some critical takes on imprisonment, but it doesn't really problematize the issue of race and mass incarceration, which is one of the most hottest, the hottest and most debated topics in America today. This is from a review of the game that just came out, and I really agree with that review. But it's kind of also easy to point at these shortcomings from the position of a critic. Obviously, it's much harder to address them from the position of a game maker. Like, I realize this all the time. I kind of have to do it all the time. So here, kind of like really neatly explains, like, well, it is problematic to leave out of a prison simulation this super important aspect, which is the issue of race. So this is a game I made, for example. It's called to build a better mousetrap, and the idea is to capture some aspects of contemporary capitalism, especially the relationship between innovation and labor. For a game about capitalism, a lot of things are missing, like the reproduction aspect, the consumption aspect is not really there. They are quite literally outside of the frame. So this is a self-consistent, super abstract, super schematic ecology with flows of resources, and there are things outside of the frame. And what's outside of the frame is just like not like this is the boundary of what I decide to tackle, what I want to tackle, what I feel like I'm capable of tackling with a simple, small game. So the rhetorical scope is even more complicated because not all the parts of the game are necessarily part of the rhetorical argument. Sometimes there are simplifications that are just there to allow the game to function as a game, to be mildly entertainment or to not be broken, right? This is still from an educational game, an actual educational game. And you don't need to know what the game is about. I think it's a kind of a Hearthstone type of game, but like without even knowing how the game works, you sense there is something wrong with the theming here. Like that there has been a kind of a compromise or a sacrifice to the altar of fun when freedom is turned into a discrete resource and Franklin is some kind of attack. So my big question is how to criticize the rhetorical scope of a game. Like, is it like how we evaluate that, how we judge that? Is it about how well the designer hides the limits that are necessarily there, the limits of her work, so they don't appear too jarring, too bizarre? Maybe it's about manifesting them and be particularly open about what the game is about and what is not. Or is it just an open ideological battlefield where omissions and design choices can be always challenged from every ethical and political standpoint? So like you made a game about architecture, but I really wanted you to make a game about crime in society. Quite honestly, I don't know. So going back to the two concerns, I think we've been focusing on the semantics of games, on this question, what do games mean, for a very good reason. And that's because we are coming from a position of denial of meaning. Only recently, video games have been considered worthy of analysis. And every time critics raise tough issues, such as the relationship between sexism and games that I was pointing out earlier, like all the time there is at least a big chunk of the gamer community that has been responding in a seemingly anti-ideological way. This is just a game. This is just designed to maximize fun. So the battle so far in the last 10 years, I would say, like, well, actually maybe more like 15 years, has been, hey, people, wake up. Games are culture. Games have meanings. They have values. They have ideologies, and so on. So here's a first foundational question related to the foundational theory of meaning. Like why people want to attribute, like so many people seem to not want to attribute any meaning to games. Like what brought us to such a state of denial? Is it just because games tend to be informed by dominant ideologies and therefore these are the invisible ideologies. They appear natural and therefore are kind of like the air we breathe, and they don't seem to make any sense or make any point. But I think there are some historical factors too. Well, first, video games don't really emerge as cultural forms, but more as experiments in computing in a way, or as coin-operated curiosities. This is the precursor of fighting games that is in the Mechanical Arcade Museum in San Francisco. They are also starting from the Nintendo Renaissance. They are also marketed as toys, so more like as objects. You see that the device is more prominent than the games, or the feel, and it's in a toy store. Also, historically, authorship in games has been downplayed. Even today in AAA productions, the company names are more recognizable than the lead designers, except for a few household names. So, an argument could be like, how can a game mean anything if there's no real creator, no real authorial intention? And moreover, the game industry itself encourages a discourse that is characterized by that characterizes these objects, games, as commodities. Like the mainstream game press still talks about games like we talk about fridges or smartphone, right? Listing the number of features, the polish level, the number of hours of gameplay. Is it worth your money or not? And so obviously all companies are wary of presenting a commercial product as meaningful because a message kind of opens the door to controversy and disagreement, so potentially limits the customer base. And I think this denial of cultural status is even enshrined in the guidelines of one of the most important distribution channels today, which is the App Store. You've probably seen that. That quote, we view apps different than books or songs, which we don't curate. If you want to criticize a religion, write a book and so on. So why are books and songs different than games and apps? Is it possible that maybe Apple would love to ban controversial or indecent books, but it couldn't really get away with that? The backlash and the losses would be huge. So the problem is, to me, I think, while games in general have been around since the dawn of humanity, computer games emerge already under a late capitalist system. They are not replaced by a cultural industry, but they directly and immediately emerge as a cultural industry. So from almost the beginning, from Atari basically, they are the fetishized, the commodified, disembodied counterparts of traditional games. And I use these terms because I stumbled upon this great quote by Jacques Attali, which is about really music, but you can easily replace music with the word games, right? And you can even think about the emergence of esports or spectator sports and game spectatorship as a further development in the direction of specialization and reduction to spectacle of the game form, even disembodiment to some extent. So another question I propose then is, are there efforts that go in the opposite direction of what mentioned here? Are there efforts, subjects, artists working toward the decommodification, de-ritualization, and re-ritualization and degeneralization of computer games as a form? I'm wondering. Because in the analog world, I can think about the street games movement, the new sports movement. There are festivals such as Come Out and Play. I think Berlin has a couple of similar festivals that are trying to bring back games to the streets and making games that are just existing outside of a realm of commodification, and they are more like traditional games, but they are contemporary. In computer games, I think about the queer games movement and how it connects DIY advocacy, DIY creation, and social specificity. Most of the works made by queer game designers are kind of intended to be mostly for the community and directed toward a member of that community. And also, a very common financial model is Patreon, which is similar to Kickstarter. Well, it's kind of like a micropayment that you do every month or week or every time an author releases something. But it's a different kind of financial support model that shifts the attention from the production of sellable objects to the support of an individual. So I'm also thinking about designers like Anna Entropy or Porpentine, even experimented with the creation of game rituals, going back to the ritualization versus ritualization. Like even experimented with the creation of game ritual. Like this is not really from the game, but it's a result of the game by a designer called Porpentine. The game is called For Those We Love Alive, that instructs at certain points the players to draw markings on their skin, sort of adding a certain solemnity to crucial moments of the game. And there is even another one called like Wish for Something Better by Anna Entropy, which is a single-person role-playing ritual. So, just a brief digression. But anyway, because of this stunted cultural status, theories around the role of games in society has always been extremely reductionist and focused on their imagined effects, like games make you violent in the 90s, games make you smarter, and games make you empathize or make you exercise better, you know. It's always a very, they are not seen as integrated in the larger cultural context, but they are instead something that is so distinct that their effects can be pinpointed, right? Like the effects of a drug. And obviously all these claims are regularly demystified by actual studies that typically reach a conclusion that is, there's no conclusive evidence that games make people violent and so on. But new one, on the same vein, new claims kind of always emerge, it seems to me. So a question is, that pertains to the foundational theory of meaning, why some people attribute certain values is, like why there is an insistence in attributing a direct transformational power to video games. Like this is a power that is rarely attributed to other form of cultures. You don't really say that books make you smarter. It's sort of implied, but not quite in that way. Is it just marketing at work? Is it just like a marketing issue and the way the games are actually sold? Is it the fear of corrupting undiscerning children, or maybe conversely the possibility to mold them into better people, you know, to shape children? Yeah, that's an old joke, right? That is kind of true. That's why it's funny. But anyway, it is. Or maybe it is because of the structural similarities with operant conditioning mechanism, you know, Skinner boxes, you know, you have interactivity, you have rewards, you have punishments, you have a kind of separation from real life and an idea of learning through replayability, through experimenting with it. So yeah, you can say games are more or less Skinner boxes, and so is that why we attribute that sort of power to games? I don't know. To me, the problem with semantic, like, just to stop the semantic aspect, to me the problem with semantic readings is that they force us to consider games as objects. They are objects possessing signs ready to be activated, you know, meanings to be ready to be unleashed by the act of playing. But games can also function as interfaces, and interfaces between people as social processes. So to me, like what a player community does with a game might go well beyond the intention of the game maker. It can, like the social use of a game can transcend the inherent qualities of a game. And that's something that if you're coming maybe from a more like semiotics approach, like I tend to do, that's something that is kind of like missing in, like you don't have the tools really to understand that. Like for example, Olympic Games and sports have very abstract mechanics that we can't totally analyze. We can see, you know, soccer as a game and talk about what these rules mean and how the experience of playing a soccer game means. But when sports and athletics, in this case is athletics, they become carriers of value, and often they do. Like they often are values about identity, of belonging, of solidarity. In this case, it's because of what happens around the game itself. The players, the fans, the spectacular apparatus. So this is another big question. How do we interpret the social use or misuse of games? Take notes. Yeah. So just an example, like the new games movement was this kind of post-hippie movement that promoted cooperative games instead of exclusively competitive ones. These are images from the original book. It's really a period piece, really. They were actually hippies. It came out from the whole Earth catalog and from the anti-Vietnam movement, right? And one of their most famous games was the lap game, which works this way, like players stand in a circle, and each player at the same time tries to sit on the lap of the player behind. And if the game works, when the coordination effort works, so that's the result. Like you have a mutually sustained circle in which each person is both relying and reliant on the neighbors who's both providing and be provided by that. And I think that this is a simple and beautiful game where the mechanics and the experience really convey a palpable sense of solidarity and trust. But yet, the game has been appropriated by team building exercise as a team building exercise in corporate and military environment. I've seen pictures like that Bernie DeKoven, one of the main proponents of this movement and this exercise, potentially the designer of this game, like showed a picture that was exactly like that, with a bunch of paramilitaries from Africa or something. And so which is arguably antithetic to the original intention of the hippies who popularized this. So here's a thing. Or another example of misuse, I think, is when commercial games are incorporated in the school curriculum. Like suddenly civilization of SimCity become educational by virtue of their institutional context. So their isomorphism, the idea that are sort of like matching some aspect of the real world, acquire a much more authoritative aura. And so what happens when it's that? Like, well, is the meaning of the object in itself changing because of that? Or another example could be Magna Santi or Magna Santi, which is it's not a game, but it's a way to play SimCity. It is the most efficient and populated dystopian city that you can possibly create in SimCity. Just a guy spent a bunch of years researching exactly the patterns of SimCity and created the ultimate solution, to some extent, to the problem of SimCity. So it's not just turning SimCity into a kind of unsettling critique of modernism, but it's also revealing SimCity for what it is at its core, which is basically a complex cellular automata dressed up as an urban simulator. And if being an algorithm, algorithms can be reverse engineered and can be optimized and manipulated in that way. Algorithms. Or another example, this is more like an artist performance, but it's called Dead in Iraq. It's a performative monument to the fallen soldiers American soldiers that takes place in the America's Army's server. So this artist will just log in this shooter produced by the US military and kind of not really play, hang around there, and every time he will get shot, he would use the in-game chat to memorialize one of the people that actually died in Iraq or Afghanistan. So he will just post a name, a date of death, a birth, and ranks. And often, creating a very strong reaction, because gamers don't like to be reminded that there is some kind of counterpart to this fictional war here. Or another similar example is the phenomenon of pacifist runs. Like there are people that are not artists, but they are simply misplaying games, first-person shooter games without shooting, and it's a sign of virtuosity. So players are not only activating and interpreting games, they are sometimes completely reinventing the experience without even modifying the game as an object. I'm not talking about modding. So maybe this is where anthropology can be useful because it can study not only what people do in a game, but what people do with a game. And what about an extreme case of misuse, like games that are experienced without being played, like how to deal with meaning in unplayed or unplayable games. And sounds like a provocation. Well, there is this classic inversion that called interpassivity. You're a philosopher, you must know about that. It's classic, it's Zizek kind of joke, right? Talks about well, we talk about interactivity, but what about the opposite of that? What about interpassivity? The fact that with an interactive media, it deprives me of my own passive reaction of satisfaction. So it's like the object itself, which enjoys the show instead of me. And the example he makes is the practice of recording TV shows using VCR, which kind of relieves you from the burden of watching a show. You keep recording shows so you don't have to watch them. And in a way, he says, the VCR itself is enjoying them on your behalf. And I think what seemed like a provocation at the time, it seemed like I thought was pretty funny, but it feels like I'm seeing this pattern more and more commonly today. like the Netflix queue, the Amazon assisted pile of books that you haven't read, the shame pile, the digital downloads without consumption, there is nearly 30% of all registered Steam games, the digital downloads games for PC, have never been played, and there are reasons for that, bundles and so on, big deals, and kind of like a race to the bottom in price, and the production of particularly meaningful, interesting games that people want to support. But anyway, there is that thing that is happening, and I think it's not only what does a game mean when it's in your Steam downloads and it's sort of like public. You're sharing your support to a Kickstarter or sharing the ownership of this game, but maybe can be more like of a cultural status, more like keeping your fancy car in the garage as a sign of your as a sign of your cultural status. Anyway, but when it's not the object itself, in this case the Steam downloader, I guess, enjoying the interactivity, it might be also somebody else. So I think there is an element of interpassivity in the emergence of computer games as spectator sports, and not to mention the huge phenomenon of YouTubers, like people getting billionaire by just posting playthroughs of games like Minecraft, and they're not just reviews. It's not that people watch these YouTubers because they want to buy a game and they want to check it first, but it's more like a kind of playing. It's a form of entertainment in itself to watch somebody else playing a game. And I think we ought to expect in the near future to expect games that are designed with an eye for this secondary non-interactive audience. There will be more and more games that are specifically conceived for a separated audience that is not going to play them. And how do we deal with them? So Robert Yang, a designer based in New York, made a bunch of very interesting games about gay culture and intimacy and so on. Recently wrote a manifesto, realizing that he made a bunch of very games that went viral, but that not many people played actually. So he recently wrote a manifesto essentially saying, embrace it, encouraging an expansive view of games that is not centered on the experience of play. And he says the most important thing about a game is that it exists, because that means that you can think about it. That's from his words. And this is not an entirely new idea. There's a lot of conceptual art, performance art, intervention art that is not experienced directly. It is meant to exist as a conversation. So for example, Jason Rohrer designed a game that is meant to be played by somebody in the distant future. He buried this board game made by in a special material in the middle of the desert and released coordinates of the exact location in a way that will take arguably thousands of years to discover. It's called A Game for Someone, and it's a kind of a concept piece similar to some conceptual land art type of stuff. It's there somewhere, and he actually designed it, and he has some documentation that shows that he seemed to actually have created it. But it's meant to be, to be a game that sort of sticks in your head, and it's meant to be you're thinking about it, and it kind of generated conversation about that. It's similar, the art board game Train. You've probably seen this picture of Train if you're following games, and you probably haven't played. How many people have played Train? 1, 2. How many people have heard of this game? Right. So it's not bad. That's great actually. I think it wasn't really meant to be played by many people. I think Brenda could have conceivably publish it as a game. But it existed through talks, through hearsay, through articles, I guess academic papers as well, or exhibited in an exhibition, non-interactive exhibition setting. And I think it's a bit ironic that a series of games that she called The Mechanics is the Message after Marshall McLuhan actually more like existed as a story, as a narrative about the game in itself and about her process of coming to this design. But that's a great example of games that you're sort of experiencing vicariously. It still possibly influences designs of other games. And think about a lot of controversies surrounding games that are based on speculation and not on actual play. I don't know, some of you might remember the case of Super Columbine Massacre back in the days. It was one of the early documentary games that was about, the Columbine school shooting. This kid decided to investigate that through a medium he knew. And this guy was more like a documentary filmmaker. That was his background and his direction. And so he made a role-playing game, so using a role-playing engine that kind of follow these two school shooters in their last day. And this is a game that everybody talked about. He went on national television, but he didn't really, very few people actually bothered to play, even just based on the descriptions and how it was mischaracterized and as a school shooter simulation and so on. And there was a recent similar case of this so-called slave Tetris. You might have seen this picture, which is just a screenshot of one of the mini games that are part of this very expansive narrative educational title called Playing History, Slave Trade, in which there are characters talking to you and so on. What really was decontextualized was this screenshot, and maybe the idea of a game like that, just you can sort of figure out how it works because everybody knows Tetris, right? It was enough to really provoke a big backlash and a big discussion without even checking the context of this mini game, of this scene. In my opinion, you also have to consider when you're creating a mini game like that people might end up decontextualizing or might end up seeing it as in its own term. And anyway, the idea that the games about this topic, or another example was by an artist. It was called Virtual Jihadi by Wafa Bilal. It was a mod of a game that was itself a mod made by Hezbollah or some kind of radical Islamist group. And the game was a major controversy back in 2000, maybe 8, the controversy was based on the fact that people didn't really get to play the game. They only saw some screenshots and they were disturbing enough. And sometimes the idea that even games just exist about this topic is already producing some kind of meaning and controversy in that sense. So I do think we should condemn journalists that feel entitled to talk about games they haven't played. But we should also recognize that this is how this cultural form of games kind of work in culture at large. So when I was designing Phone Story, for example, that was an iPhone game about the production process of iPhones. So it was showing the mining of coltan in Congo and workers in China, Foxconn workers committing suicide and so on. I kind of knew that it was very likely to be banned from the App Store because the whole point was to have a game about the subject on that particular device. I kind of knew that it was probably going to be banned, and so I tried to design the gameplay in a way that it kind of conveyed the situation, the point. It was readable essentially by screenshots because I was suspecting that possibly most of the people would have seen the screenshot rather than the game itself. So clear vignette, no scrolling. That's why it's also not a very good game, to be honest. But it kind of worked as media intervention to some extent. There were other works that had a similar a similar kind of take on it, and were also taken down, were also banned, but they didn't get probably as much mileage because you couldn't really see what the games were about from the screenshots, you know. Anyway, there's also this recent game that came out last week called The Beginner's Guide that follows, it's a follow-up to the Stanley Parable, and I don't know if you played it, but it kind of directly problematizes the idea of games as concept pieces. It's talking about kind of like an imaginary outsider game designer who creates a bunch of small experimental games that nobody ever gets to play. And there is this voiceover, which is Davey, like the creator of the game, of the meta game, who's just speaking as himself, saying, "Oh, I know this guy that made these games here, and I think they are very interesting because, for example, there is a moment in which you get to see a huge scenario that you never get to explore, and they are kind of like conceptual games in that sense." And the game also display a kind of interpassivity as storytelling device, because the voiceover is guiding you through these environments, and it's interpreting these environments for you, and it's even like reacting emotionally to this environment. So the game itself is sort of like playing these games on your behalf. So another just example, I'm about to finish. Harry Gilles created a collection of games that are called Casual Games for Casual Hikers. And it's a collection of games that they are totally playable, but they probably work better as poems, as games that you're supposed to just see and witness, you know, to try, like, take a second to read the instructions here. Yeah. Yeah, there are a bunch of games in that veins. They don't require anything but your mind and a set of rules. And I think there is a poetic of unplayed games that we shouldn't dismiss. And they pose a big problem of interpretation. Like, what is that? Is that concept piece by Yoko Ono a game in itself, you know? And I don't know, maybe perhaps that's where we should, we are encouraged to drop our analytical tools and just let these games play in our minds. Anyway, this is all I have to say. Thank you very much. Sorry for the unclimatic things. 042. Is there Q&A, or should I just? Okay, that's great. Where's Q&A? Okay, so the game works this way. You're probably familiar with a controversy around, well, it was more than a controversy, it was a big debate around the cultural status of the Confederate flag after a really serious racially motivated mass shooting in a church. Shouldn't work that well. In a church, the shooter, the perpetrator, was found. You know, like pictures with him with a Confederate flag, and so there was a big movement to essentially ban across the board the Confederate flag. Like Walmart decided to remove all the products that were using that flag or displaying that particular visual, and even in games, the Apple Store pretty much got rid of all the games that even the historical games about the Civil War that were just contextualizing the Confederate flag properly were for a little bof time banned, and there was discussion about it, and so decided to make a quick game in which you're supposed to boo at this flag and kind of like take it down, and that's what we are going to play today all together. All right, you have to boo, otherwise slow frequencies. Go on. Oh, what was boo was much better with me. Anyway, boo. I should connect a microphone, but yeah, you boo, and it eventually goes down and burns and so on. But to me that is a pretty. I mean, it's so simple that it can be unpacked pretty easily, and yet it produces some misinterpretations. To me, like, this is the twofold sort of interpretation that you have. You have a symbolic system that is very simple. It's that flag and has controversial, contested meanings. Like, some people think, I guess, just by talking very loud. Some people just think that it represents a certain pride and Southern pride and Southern value. Some other people just think that that's a symbol of white supremacism, and it's like a crypto-racist sort of thing. But yeah, like, so that there's that symbol, and then there is the system that kind of like makes it work. That actually, if I can even like show you the code, which is super. Oh, I guess I can't, huh? But anyway, you can see the simple algorithm that sort of makes the rhetorical argument that if you don't keep booing, racism will tend to rise, and there is a tipping point in which you are sort of changing this history, and you're sort of breaking this tug of war. So there is an end to this symbolic battle, and then there is a message at the end that has disturbed a bunch of people because it sounded dismissive of that kind of struggle, and in a way it is, but it's simply restoring the symbolic value of this battle as, or like reframing it as an actual symbolic value. So that flag is not a metaphor, an allegory for racism in general, but the flag in the game is still a flag in the game. Anyway. Yeah, questions?
Okay. You can keep the mic.
Oh, yeah, okay. I can keep
okay, questions or comments? Yes?
Thanks, Paolo, for your inspiring talk. That was really great. And also very modest that you talked so little about your own games and so much about others. But I still have to come back to your own production and your own role as a designer, as a game designer. And what I'm interested in is when you design a game, let's say something like the critique of fast food things, this anti-McDonald's game, you somehow are in the process of meaning production or design of ways of how this meaning is conveyed. How does that work for you? Is that something like an initial phase that kicks off the design process and then everything follows this initial idea, or is it in another way? The reason why I ask that is when I talk to musical composers, they say, well, I never start with the intention, well, I create a piece that expresses alienation in a complex capitalist world, but somehow I start with the music and then the meaning slips in. So how is it in your personal design practice?
No. It starts with capitalism, definitely. No, in my case, no. It generally starts as so there is this thing that happens all the time that you're not basing a game on reality or actual experience. Like until recently, until the emergence of autobiographical games, that wasn't a thing. Like even SimCity is not really based on Will Wright ideas of cities, but more like on system dynamics that was in itself a model. So there is like a second level of mediation. Prison Architect is based on ideas of the prison system from movies, and GTA is based not on Los Angeles, but on the gangster rap version of Los Angeles, right? GTA 4. In my case too, like I usually start like reading books or reading about theories, and I like to put them into a playable form. I would say only recently. So I do like ask myself, okay, what do I want to have it here, like in this game? And I know that this is not a particularly common design practice. If you are like a more like a serious tight designer, you might even want to start with a very abstract system, starting from this field of possibilities, and then you kind of applied a theme to it, especially like board game makers. I think that's where you have probably an easier way to separate between mechanics and theme and narrative devices that are there. I think they often start with abstract themes and then introduce some theming, and then maybe they go back and expand on the theme. Sometimes, yeah, the fascination starts from mechanics. Not in my case, though. Yeah, I kind of start from the experience and the ideas I like. And yeah, I was saying that more recently, especially like in the game I didn't show that it's called like the best amendment. I didn't really start with an idea, with a theory. It's just it's almost like the game came to me as an already systematic theory. It wasn't like, oh, there is a message that I want to translate in a dynamic form. I think the message itself, to me, is dynamic in itself. I don't know if it makes sense. It sounds like I'm, yeah.
So with your last example here, Boo at the Flag, you commented on the algorithm, which you believe could show an argument.
Right.
Do you believe that meaning can be inherent in the code of games?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to show you. Okay. Yeah. Well, the code in itself, I guess. The code in itself, yeah. So this issue was talking about of interpretation has a parallel in game design, the practice of game design. Game design has been referred as a second-order type of design problem. You're not producing something that produces meaning or produces an experience. You're not shaping the experience of the player in itself, but rather you're producing a machine that produces a thing that produces an experience, right? So that's also like it gets complicated when you want to say things. So you're not making an argument, but you're making something that makes an argument about something. And I think code is essentially what you are actually shaping and manipulating: the code, the rule system, the graphics. I think the game in itself. The code in itself can be carrier of meaning, but there's not much you can do or see from the code itself. Like I'm going to show you this simple. No, cancel. You see it? No. Yeah. Here, just for fun, I like to to have variable names like racism, and the actual mechanic of the game is like so simple that it's almost embarrassing to show. It's this. So if pitch, okay, yeah, you can see it. So the race, like, okay, so if the pitch is right, if you're booing enough, so if it detects some low frequency, the racism is decreased by a variable called, a constant called discourse effectiveness, multiplied by the loudness / divided by the Southern pride. The Southern pride is what pushed the flag up. The discourse effectiveness is what do I think that the discourse is, like bitching about something online or censoring things, is how does it actually affect the world, and the loudness is the actual like interaction of the player, and or else. The racism is increased by a constant called inaction. So like, what if you're just living, the racists do their thing, and that inaction is the cost of it, and the flags goes up. Anyway, so can code in itself convey meaning? I think so, but a mechanic without theme doesn't really do too much. Actually, there is another game, like this stupid boo flag, I can't believe I'm spending so much time talking about it, but it's actually based on another game that is actually very similar. It was almost a remix of this game that I really love, called Americlap. Americlap is exactly the same game, except you have to clap to keep the American flag up. Otherwise it kind of like goes down and you lose. So in this case, there's no endpoint, there's no goal. You just keep clapping forever, and the fact that you're keeping clapping forever kind of adds, that's the whole point. That's the whole like sarcastic commentary on patriotism and American exceptionalism and so on. So this is like almost identical mechanic, just like with a couple of signs inverted, but a very different symbolic aspect, like a very different symbolic layer, makes it a totally different game.
Thank you. I like your variable names as well. This idea about rhetorical scope, I don't know whether you find that important, but I find it interesting at least. Sort of that. So first, I think there's a distinction between sort of the scope of the game medium as opposed to the scope of an individual game or a genre or something like that. But so one way to state a question on the basis of that, maybe, do you think that the scope of those two things, you can pick any one you want, is that determined mostly by the medium itself or by sort of conventions related to the medium and sort of interpretive discourse? Do you see where I'm going with that? So in the sense that, is this something intrinsically related to games, or is it more of a sort of education/communication problem?
So is it related to games like, can you have a, yeah, I think there is a kind of subject of inquiry that happens in all sort of media, and you can think of maybe like devices in narrative media that are there just to, to just give you a narrative hook or some kind of emotional involvement that are not necessarily that important. There is a bunch of things in, I can't think of a good example, but in fiction, like a fiction might make a particular statement or give you some ideas about, I don't know, like global warming. Is Game of Thrones about global warming and that kind of impending catastrophe and working together to solve it? But then there are other things and other like books and stuff that are just there for making it work as a show.
But do you think that rhetorical scope of games is sort of very different from the rhetorical scope of other sort of art forms, and sort of a little bit like procedural rhetoric, stuff like that? And sort of, well, is that something that matters to you as a game designer, sort of what it is that you can do here?
Yeah, I think it's functioning in a different way, because we are not really, I don't know, if it functions in a certain way, maybe because of the way, I'm kind of like thinking about it, but maybe in the way that we frame games. Like when a kid looks at SimCity, really thinks that it is a comprehensive model. And it's probably like in the same way you look at the documentary and you don't really think of what's outside of the frame or what gets edited out. So there are similar ethical issues, obviously, that you're doing. But I think there is also a level of deception that happened. Well, I guess it's probably just the same thing. It's a degree of artifice that you have to deploy to make sure that this limits, that the area you are investigating is like these limits are not really disturbing, that they are not really, oh, you're banging against an invisible wall in a necessarily limited game scenario, right? The same way, like they are trying to hide these invisible walls in games, you have to try to hide the limits of the inquiry. I think another interesting example is the treatment. You probably all played the Papers, Please, which is this game about. Well, let's go for it. Let's go with another question. Yeah.
Okay, I think we are out of time, actually. Thank you very much for your talk.
All right.
And, well...
Thank you.